privilege to be with you in worship today. I've known of this church for a long time. You see, back during that dark Duke chapter of my life that Trey referred to earlier, I served as first the associate minister and then later on as the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Henderson, North Carolina. And on several occasions during those 2 tenures, I had the chance to be in this church. I've known of 2 of your former pastors. I came to respect Dr. Kroon highly in my early years in ministry. Daniel Glaze and I were at Baptist Seminary at Richmond together, although he is younger than me, and he'd want me to point that out. And I've really enjoyed the chance to get to know Trey over this last year as we look forward to today. So I'm grateful for the chance to worship with you, to get a sense of the beauty of the ways Jesus is at work in your life together, and to thank you for your partnership with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship from our very first days until now. This afternoon I'll have more opportunities to share with those of you who are interested a word about the life and ministry of our fellowship and to answer any questions you have. But for our remaining time this morning, I want to invite you to listen with me to these words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The writer of Matthew's Gospel invites us to participate in a most urgent moment in the life of Jesus and the beginning of his ministry. You see, up until now, he's been at work calling his first disciples. Now, with those first disciples identified, he goes up to a mountainside near the Sea of Galilee, and he invites those same disciples to step out of the crowds, that is, to step out of the larger cultures that raised them, and join him on that mountainside. Matthew says that those first disciples take Jesus up on his invitation. They step away from the crowds. They draw closer to him. In what would be, I think, a most uncomfortable convention if we were to try it now, he sat down to teach, and they all stood around him. You want to try that? I'll sit, you stand, I'll talk till 12:30 like Trey said, and we'll see how that works. Just kidding. They come near him. He opens his mouth, and he's about to speak the very first word that he ever spoke to his followers. It's a word he speaks not only to those first 12. It's a word he speaks to us this morning by the power of the Holy Spirit. What is the first word that Jesus will speak to those who have given their lives to follow him? Will he begin with high-minded, lofty theological rhetoric? Will he begin by saying, if you're going to follow me, this is the statement to which you must subscribe? No. He doesn't start at 30,000 feet. He doesn't start with an abstract of principles. Instead, he starts with language that establishes the posture, the orientation of faith, when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. What exactly does that mean? The way Matthew remembers it anyway, Jesus doesn't just say, blessed are the poor. No, Jesus' first words are, blessed are the poor in spirit. One of my teachers almost 30 years ago at Wake Forest was Dr. Charles Talbert, and I had him for a class on the Sermon on the Mount. And when we came to this very first sentence of the sermon, Dr. Talbert paused for quite some time to unpack the meaning of this unusual phrase. The way he explained it then, and I still believe it now, to be poor in spirit is to recognize our absolute dependence on God. To be poor in spirit is to recognize the truth that Martin Luther later taught us to sing, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. To be poor in spirit is to recognize that our life itself depends on the grace of God. Our possibility of following Jesus depends on the invitation of God. Our ability to face the challenges that life throws our way requires the mercy and the provision and the providence of God. To be poor in spirit is to recognize our absolute need for God. To recognize that we do not have it in ourselves to follow Jesus. That we do not have it in ourselves to face the challenges of life. Discipleship does not begin then with a statement of my self-sufficiency. But instead, being a Christian begins by throwing myself headlong into the mercies of God and drinking deeply from the water of salvation. Being a Christian begins in a statement not of independence, but of dependence. To be poor in spirit, to be meek, as the third beatitude says, is to recognize our need for God, our dependence on God, our inability to make it on our own. So from the beginning, the posture of faith is humility. But that's not just true in the beginning. Sometimes people see that this first phrase of the Sermon on the Mount is the beginning, and sometimes they kind of give us the impression by their preaching or by their spirit or by their attitude that humility is the introductory step in the Christian faith, but then somehow we grow up beyond it and we become more self-sufficient or more sure of ourselves. But humility is not just the beginning posture of faith. Humility is the whole life of faith. If you don't believe it, listen to what Jesus says in other places. Jesus says a little later in the gospel, unless you change and become like children, you cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Unless you take the humility of a child, you cannot enter. Or think of what he said when his disciples were having an argument over which would have the places of greatest power when Jesus established his kingdom. You know, when they were preparing their resumes to be in Jesus' political cabinet. You remember what he said? Those who are the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Not so with you. The one who will be greatest among you must be your servant. Jesus, by his teaching across his ministry, makes it clear that humility is not just the place faith begins. Humility is the posture of faith throughout our life of faith. You heard it in the prophecy of Micah. What does the Lord require of you? You remember, Anita did it well. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. You even hear it in the writings of St. Paul, even though sometimes some people have accused Paul of not always being so humble himself. Anybody ever heard that before? Paul said of his own preaching and his own life, we see through a glass darkly. Our preaching is imperfect. Our prophesying is incomplete. We see through a mirror dimly. Paul told the Philippians, do nothing out of ambition or selfish conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. We shouldn't be surprised, after all, that humility is the posture of the Christian faith, because humility is at the heart of the gospel. What is that old hymn Philippians quotes in Philippians 2? That Christ did not count equality with God as something to be exploited, but instead he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient even to the point of death on a cross. The posture of faith is humility. And if you draw near Jesus' first disciples and you listen to Jesus as he speaks his very first word to them, you hear it clearly. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the humble. Blessed are those who know our absolute need for God. And no matter how far we go with Christ or where our life takes us, we never lose that humility, that basic posture, that initial orientation that throws ourselves into the rivers of God's mercy in Jesus Christ. Of course, hearing that requires us to step out of the crowd, doesn't it? I've been doing some research lately in the way people perceive Baptists. Now, it's not scientific research. It's more like the research of overhearing and observing. There may be social scientists in the room who want me to show my work, so I want to be real clear. But I'm pretty satisfied that if I had enough spare time to do a social science survey, and I had enough money to go survey people generally on how they perceive Baptists, and what word comes to their mind first when they hear the word Baptist, I'm pretty sure humble would not be usually mentioned. I'm pretty sure if people were asked today to describe the dominant culture of our world, the dominant culture of our life and times, humble would not be a word used to describe many, many people in the world today. I'm pretty sure that spiritual poverty, that is, recognizing our absolute need for God, our inadequacy in our own selves, our need for another and another community, that sounds like language of an entirely different world, in a world today that is so much marked by arrogance, so much marked by domination, so accustomed now to dealing with difference of opinion by demonizing someone else and by asserting that I know everything, and if you agree with me, you must be really smart. But if you disagree with me, we used to have a word for that. It was called Baptist. But now if you disagree with me, there's something mortally flawed with your soul. You see, arrogance breeds contempt. Arrogance breeds a false sense of self-worth. Arrogance appoints myself to be the theological and political and ethical and moral policeman of the whole universe, but not humility. Humility recognizes that I see through a mirror dimly even when I think I see most clearly. Humility recognizes that I cannot make it through the challenges of this world or the demands of following Jesus without being carried by God's grace and surrounded by a community of believers who can keep me in the way when in my own strength I would fall away. Humility requires me not to be judgmental or condemning or to push people away, but rather to be open and curious. Humility breeds a hospitality toward others that recognizes that everyone else stands as much in the need of God's amazing grace as I do. Humility is the posture of faith. And if we're going to step out of the crowds and bring ourselves close enough to Jesus that we can hear him speak today, we're going to have to leave behind the noise of arrogance and throw ourselves head first into the waters of mercy and love. Sometimes I think Jesus sends us people to remind us of that. And I'm not talking about guest preachers. I remember when I was growing up in the First Baptist Church of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, being deeply moved by the examples of several people who I thought were just incredible Christian role models. There was this older couple, late 80s, early 90s. Of course, bear in mind, I was 15, 10, so they might have been younger than that. I just might have thought they were that old. Has life ever done that to you? Now I'm just old. They were in church every Sunday. They came together and sat over there. They came to Sunday school together. They taught Sunday school together. They knew everybody by name. They drew no attention to themselves at all. They were quiet. They were loving. They were hospitable. They were humble. And in a congregation that in that stage went through more than its share of conflict and travail and difficulty, there they were every Sunday in their kindness and in their warmth, in their simplicity, in their example, calling us back to that hillside by the Sea of Galilee where we could hear Jesus say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." I remember that in the same congregation at the same time was another person who I thought was really old. He was past retirement. Maybe some of you have heard of him. His name was Clifton Allen. Now, Clifton, I learned much later in life, was a biblical scholar who had been the president of the Sunday School Board of the Southern Baptist Convention and overseeing the development of the first Broadman Bible commentary series. If anyone had a resume he could trot around at church, it would have been Clifton Allen. I didn't know anything about that until years later. But what I knew was that he too came to church every Sunday. He too spoke an encouraging word to everybody he met. And I remember vividly now that April Sunday in 1987 that was Youth Sunday. And I was a high school senior and I had preached the sermon. If you search to the mountains or descend to the depths, you'll not find the manuscript of that sermon because I had destroyed it. It wasn't very good. After the service was over, I did what you Sunday preachers did. I stood at the front, and people came through the line and spoke words of encouragement. And Clifton, who would have actually known a good sermon when he saw it, only spoke words of kindness. And he said, "You should think about doing that again." Simplicity, kindness, generosity. He said, "Can't you remember what Jesus said? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are not so full of themselves that they advertise themselves everywhere they go. Blessed are those who are so in touch with the extent to which their lives depend on the mercy of God that their lives become a sign of God's mercy to a broken, hurting, polarized, arrogant, divided world. Blessed are those whose hearts are so washed by a love that will not go, that they reach out in kindness and invite others in. I have this sense, y'all, to use a good Southern Greek word, to the kind of witness Jesus needs today. In a Husky, and in Atlanta, in the 20 countries where Cooperative Baptists have missionaries, and in congregations all over, is a witness of people whose faith flows from such a dependence on God that when people see us, they see humility. That humility might not just save our souls. It might save the world. So come closer. Listen carefully to the very first word Jesus ever taught his disciples. I don't know about you, Trey, in preaching class, they said the first word matters. Blessed are the poor